They fined me $900 because my old snowblower woke up their neighborhood too early, and they honestly thought I was going to apologize. What they didn't know was that the same people trying to control my morning routine were living on water that legally crossed my family's land. And they had no idea the little piece of paper sitting in my grandfather's old metal box was about to change everything. My name is Caleb Whitmore. I'm 49 years old, and for most of my life, I never wanted a fight with anyone. I grew up believing that good neighbors didn't look for ways to hurt each other. They looked for ways to help each other. But sometimes people forget that respect works both ways. I inherited 126 acres outside a small town called Ridgefield Hollow, Vermont, back in 2011 after my father passed away. The land had been in my family since 1891, when my great-great-grandfather cleared the first field by hand and built the original farmhouse that still stands today. It's not the kind of property you see in magazines. The paint on the barn is faded. The fence posts lean a little after every winter, and my tractor has more scratches than I can count. But every mark has a story. Every corner of that land carries someone's fingerprints. When I walk across those fields in the early morning, I'm not just walking through dirt and grass. I'm walking through generations of people who sacrificed everything to keep that place alive. The problem started when the land around me changed. Over the years, the empty fields and forests surrounding my farm slowly disappeared, replaced by a luxury development called Maple Crest Estates. Suddenly, there were expensive homes everywhere. Stone driveways, perfectly trimmed lawns, outdoor fireplaces, and people who looked at my farm like it was something that didn't belong anymore. The man behind the development was Grant Holloway, the president of the Maple Crest Homeowners Association and the same person who had purchased most of the surrounding land years earlier. Grant was the kind of guy who always seemed to be wearing a clean jacket even when he was standing in mud. He drove a brand new SUV, talked about property values constantly, and had a way of making every conversation sound like he was doing you a favor. At first, I tried to get along with him. I really did. I even attended a few community meetings because I thought maybe we could find common ground. But it became obvious pretty quickly that Grant didn't see me as a neighbor. He saw me as a problem he hadn't solved yet. My farm didn't have a modern gate. It didn't have decorative landscaping, and sometimes my equipment made noise. To him, that meant I was lowering the image of his expensive neighborhood. One morning in January, after a heavy snowstorm covered everything in white, I woke up at 5:45 a.m. and started clearing the driveway and access roads around my farmhouse. I've done that routine for decades. When you live in the country, snow doesn't wait for business hours. You either deal with it or you get stuck. About 2 days later, I found an envelope attached to my front door. It wasn't a friendly reminder. It wasn't a conversation request. It was a violation notice from Maple Crest Estates, a $900 fine for excessive noise during restricted morning hours. I actually laughed when I read it, not because it was funny, but because it was so ridiculous I thought maybe I had misunderstood something. I wasn't part of their HOA. I never signed their documents. I never agreed to their rules. My property existed long before their neighborhood did. I walked into my kitchen holding that paper, and my wife looked at me and asked, "Are they seriously trying to fine you for using your own equipment on your own land?" I put the notice on the table and said, "Apparently, they are." Later that afternoon, Grant showed up at my driveway. He stepped out of his SUV wearing a perfectly pressed coat while I was standing there in work boots covered in snow. He looked around like he was inspecting a property he already owned. "Caleb," he said, "we're trying to maintain a certain standard around here." I looked at him and asked, "Around here meaning where?" Because last time I checked, this was still my driveway. He smiled in that way people smile when they think they're being patient with someone they consider beneath them. "This isn't personal. It's about community expectations." I looked at the notice in my hand and then back at him. "A community I don't belong to just fined me for something I'm legally allowed to do?" His expression changed slightly, just for a second, but I noticed it because deep down, I think Grant knew he was pushing into territory that wasn't his. He just assumed I wouldn't push back. That night, I sat alone in my barn after everyone went to sleep. The old heater hummed in the corner. Snow tapped against the roof, and I kept staring at that $900 paper sitting on my workbench. I could have paid it. I could have ignored it. I could have done what a lot of people do when dealing with powerful neighbors and just accepted the headache. But something bothered me. It wasn't the money. It was the message behind it. They weren't just saying my snowblower was too loud. They were saying they believed they had authority over my land, And that's when I remembered something my father told me years before he died. He said, "Son, land is only yours if you're willing to protect what comes with it." The next morning, I opened the old fireproof box that had been sitting in the corner of my barn for years. Inside were decades of family records, old photographs, and documents I had barely looked at. I wasn't searching for revenge. I wasn't trying to start a war. I was simply trying to understand exactly where my rights ended and where theirs began. And what I found buried underneath those old papers was something nobody in Maple Crest Estates knew existed. I pulled the dusty document out of the box and carefully unfolded it on my workbench. The paper was old, the edges were worn, and the ink had faded in places, but the words were still clear enough to read. It was a land agreement from 1928, signed by my great-grandfather and a regional water company that no longer existed under the same name. At first, I thought it was just another piece of family history, something interesting but probably irrelevant. Then I started reading the details, and my entire perspective changed. The agreement wasn't about selling the land. It was about granting a limited access easement through a section of my northern field for a very specific purpose. The water company was allowed to maintain a pipeline that crossed my property, but there were conditions. The access was granted only for agricultural support and rural service needs. Any expansion for commercial development required written approval from the landowner. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I grabbed the flashlight and walked outside toward the north field. Underneath that frozen ground was the same pipeline that had been there for nearly a century, the same pipeline that now supplied water to Maple Crest Estates. I stood there in the snow, looking toward those expensive houses with their glowing windows and perfect landscaping, and suddenly everything made sense. Grant Holloway hadn't just built a neighborhood next to my farm. He had built an entire development using infrastructure that crossed my property without ever asking for permission. For years, they had treated my land like an inconvenience while quietly depending on it. I went back inside and started researching. I spent days going through county records, old maps, and archived documents. The more I found, the clearer the picture became. When Maple Crest was developed, the water company expanded service lines to support the new homes, but nobody had ever updated the original agreement. Nobody had contacted me. Nobody had negotiated new terms. They simply assumed the old arrangement still covered them. And maybe for a while, nobody noticed because my family wasn't the type to make noise. We weren't lawyers. We weren't developers. We were farmers. We fixed our own fences, repaired our own equipment, and minded our own business. But there's a difference between being peaceful and being powerless. That was something I had to remind myself. I sat at my kitchen table that night with a cup of coffee getting cold beside me. My wife watched me read through the papers again and again. She finally said, "Caleb, what are you thinking?" I looked up and told her the truth. I think they picked the wrong person to underestimate. I didn't rush into anything. I knew emotions could make people do stupid things. I didn't want to become the angry farmer everyone expected me to be. I wanted facts. I wanted proof. So I contacted a property attorney and showed him everything. He spent almost an hour silently reviewing the documents. Finally, he leaned back and said, "Caleb, do you understand what you have here?" I said. "I understand they might have a problem." He smiled slightly and said, "No, they have a very expensive problem." That was when we prepared the formal notice. Not a threat, not an attack, just a legal statement explaining that the current use violated the original easement agreement and that the parties needed to negotiate a new arrangement. The letter gave the water company a deadline to respond. Either they could correct the unauthorized commercial use, or they could sit down and create a new agreement that respected my property rights. I sent it on a Monday morning. Then I waited. The first day, nothing happened. The second day, nothing happened. Honestly, I started wondering if they would ignore it the same way they ignored everything else. Then, just after lunch on the third day, I heard tires coming up my gravel driveway. I looked out the window and saw Grant Holloway's SUV parked near my barn. I knew immediately this wasn't a friendly visit. He walked toward the house with that same confident expression he always had, but something was different this time. He wasn't walking like a man who owned the room. He was walking like someone trying to figure out how much control he had left. He knocked once and opened the door before I answered. "Caleb, what exactly you're trying to do here?" he asked. I stayed calm. "I sent a letter explaining the situation." He laughed. "A letter? You're threatening an entire community because you're upset about a fine?" I looked at him and said, "No, Grant. The fine is the reason." I looked deeper. The problem started long before that. He crossed his arms. You don't understand what you're dealing with. There are hundreds of families here. I nodded. I know, and I'm not trying to hurt anyone. But those families are living in homes built on a system that was never properly authorized. That was the first moment his confidence slipped. He asked, "What are you talking about?" I walked over to the table and placed the old agreement in front of him. At first, he barely looked interested. He picked it up like he expected to find nothing. Then he read the first paragraph, then the second, then the section about commercial use. The room got quiet. I watched his face change slowly. The frustration disappeared. The arrogance disappeared. For the first time since I met him, Grant looked uncertain. "Where did you get this?" he asked. I almost smiled. "From my family's records. The same place it's been sitting for almost 100 years. He put the paper down and stared at me. "You realize what this could mean?" I said. "Yes. It means we need to have a conversation about respecting agreements." He didn't argue after that. He left without another word. The next morning, my phone rang. It was the legal department from North Valley Water Services, the company now responsible for the pipeline. The attorney on the other end sounded completely different from Grant. There was no anger, no attitude, just concern. He explained that they needed to find a solution quickly because cutting off service wasn't something anyone wanted. I told him I agreed. I never wanted innocent families caught in the middle, but I also told him something important. A mistake can happen once. Ignoring someone's rights for years is a choice. Over the next few days, the situation became bigger than I ever expected. The water company reviewed the documents. Their attorneys confirmed the issue. Then came the meeting. They arrived at my farmhouse. 6 people sitting around my kitchen table where my family had eaten dinner for generations. Grant was there, 2 attorneys representing the HOA, the water company's CEO, and 2 board members from Maple Crest. The same people who once treated my farm like an eyesore were now sitting in my kitchen asking me to solve a problem they created. I poured coffee for everyone. Nobody said much. Finally, the CEO looked at me and said, "Mr. Whitmore, we need to find a fair agreement." I nodded and slid my proposal across the table. I wasn't interested in revenge. I wasn't interested in embarrassing anyone. I wanted recognition that my property mattered. The agreement included a long-term payment arrangement for the continued use of the easement, official recognition of my land rights, removal of any HOA attempts to regulate my property, and reimbursement of the original snowblower fine that started everything. Grant picked up the document and immediately shook his head. "This is excessive." One of the attorneys quietly touched his arm and said, "Grant, you need to understand the position we're in." For the first time, nobody in the room was listening to Grant. They were listening to reality. The decision was simple. They had 72 hours to accept the terms or begin a much longer legal battle that could affect hundreds of people. When everyone finally left my house that evening, I stood outside watching their vehicles disappear down the driveway. The same driveway where Grant had once arrived to tell me I needed to follow his rules. Now he was leaving because he had finally learned one. You can build walls, neighborhoods, and businesses around someone's land, but you can't erase the rights that came with it. The next 3 days felt strange because for the first time in years, I wasn't the person waiting for someone else's decision. I was the person everyone else was waiting on. I still fed the animals every morning, still checked the fences, still climbed into my old tractor with the same coffee cup sitting in the holder, but something had changed. The people who once looked at my farm like it was outdated were finally seeing what I had always known. Value isn't always measured by how new something looks. Sometimes it's hidden in history, in records, in promises made long before anyone in a luxury development ever arrived. On the 4th day, I received the call. The agreement was accepted. The water company would enter a new long-term contract with my family. The HOA would officially remove any attempt to enforce their rules on my property, and the $900 snowblower fine that started the entire mess would be returned with additional compensation for the trouble they caused. The final numbers were far bigger than anything I expected when I opened that envelope months earlier. But honestly, the money was never the part that mattered most to me. What mattered was that someone finally admitted they had crossed a line. A week later, the Maple Crest board held an emergency meeting. The residents were angry, confused, and frustrated. Some blamed Grant. Some blamed the water company. Some blamed me. I understood that. From their perspective, they were hearing a story where their comfortable lives suddenly became complicated because of a disagreement with a farmer they barely knew. But what they didn't understand was that I never woke up one morning wanting a fight with 300 families. I wasn't looking for attention. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was trying to protect something that belonged to my family long before their neighborhood had a name. A few days after the agreement was finalized, I saw Grant for the last time. He stopped by my property, but he didn't come with anger this time. He stood near the fence line, looking across the fields. For a moment, he actually looked like a different person. "You know," he said, "I thought you were just being difficult." I leaned against the fence and said, "A lot of people mistake patience for weakness." He nodded slowly. "Maybe I did." It wasn't a dramatic apology. There was no movie moment where everything suddenly became perfect. Real life usually doesn't work that way. Sometimes people don't admit they were wrong the way you want them to. Sometimes the best you get is silence and a handshake. But for me, that was enough. Because the real victory wasn't watching Grant lose his position or seeing the HOA deal with the consequences. The real victory was waking up the next morning and hearing my snowblower running at 6 a.m. without worrying that someone was going to tell me I didn't belong on my own land. I still have that original violation notice sitting in my office. Not because I'm angry about it anymore, but because it reminds me of something important. Small problems can reveal much bigger truths. A $900 fine wasn't really about noise. It was about control. It was about someone believing they had the right to decide what another person could do with property they never owned. And sometimes, the person everyone underestimates is the one person who actually knows the full story. I think about my great-grandfather sometimes, standing in those same fields more than a century ago. He probably never imagined that one day a neighborhood of expensive homes would surround the farm he built for nothing. But I'm pretty sure he would understand one thing. Land isn't just about what sits on top of it. It's about the responsibility that comes with protecting it. So, I want to ask you something. If you were in my position, would you have fought the HOA? Or would you have just paid the fine and moved on? Do you think property rights should always come before community expectations? Or is there a point where neighbors have to compromise for the greater good? I want to hear your opinion because these situations aren't always as simple as right and wrong. Sometimes they're about respect, history, and who gets to decide what happens on land that isn't theirs. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you stand, and if you've ever dealt with a neighbor, HOA, or community that pushed too far. Share your story. Your experience might be the one someone else needs to hear.